My name is Nathan Cole, age 35, a field surveyor contracted through the Bureau of Land Management for infrastructure assessments across southern Utah. My work sounds more interesting than it is. Miles of remote trailheads, old service roads, and outdated maps that need to be verified before the government releases certain parcels of land for development or historical preservation. Most days are a rotation of GPS marking, photographing, and filling out condition reports. I've worked alone for years and have grown used to the rhythm of silence, to red dust on my boots and sunburn on the back of my neck. I know how to read a horizon. I know when something doesn't belong on it. It was late October when I drove into Kane County to chart a decommissioned parcel near the Paria Plateau, a stretch of slick rock and fractured sandstone that drops into mazes of dry washes and slot canyons. The assignment was simple: locate an old emergency supply cache marked in a 1960s government survey, photograph its condition, and flag the coordinates. There was a note in the margin: possible Cold War fallout shelter, unconfirmed, typed in that faint gray ink that used to fade off carbon copies. I didn't think much of it. Utah is full of relics: abandoned mining shafts, ranch foundations, even fake test bunkers built for civil defense drills. Most are empty holes in the ground, long forgotten. I reached the boundary by mid-morning. The road dissolved into sand and scrub. I parked my truck beside a rock formation that looked like a collapsed arch and packed like hydration bladder, flashlight, rope, GPS receiver, notebook, and a small first aid kit. The air was already dry enough to crack my lips. From the elevation ridge, the landscape rippled out in bands of rust and ochre. Wind scraped loose grit across the ground, the kind of whispering sound that makes you think of footsteps behind you even when you know better. About a mile from the truck, I found the first anomaly: a metal pole half buried at an angle, maybe 2 inches thick, painted in what looked like faded yellow. It was smooth, almost too clean for how old it seemed. I brushed sand away and saw the stenciled letters CD inside a triangle: Civil Defense. My pulse quickened. These markers were used in the 1950s to designate emergency supply or shelter points. Most had been removed decades ago. I pulled out my GPS, logged the coordinates, and followed the slope downward where the pole pointed. At first, there was nothing but low scrub and scattered boulders. Then I noticed the ground itself had a different texture: a shallow depression shaped like an oval, its center slightly darker than the surrounding soil. I knelt down and dug with my hands until my knuckles hit metal. The sound was hollow, unmistakable. I brushed away more sand. Beneath was a steel hatch, round and reinforced with bolts along the edge. The paint had almost entirely flaked off, leaving streaks of orange rust like dried blood. In the center was a recessed wheel handle, frozen stiff from years of neglect. I crouched there for a while, taking it in. My first thought was that it might have been sealed for safety reasons, but the padlock on the latch had long since corroded through. The cover was half buried by a drift of sand, and one hinge looked partially sheared. I radioed the coordinates to my supervisor, though I knew reception here was spotty at best. Static. I tried again. Nothing, not unusual, but it left a hollow feeling in my chest. I wedged my multitool into the wheel and applied slow pressure. The handle groaned but shifted an inch, then another. When the seal finally broke, a gust of stale air rose up, thick and cold with the smell of metal and dust. My flashlight beam caught a descending ladder fixed to a concrete shaft. I hesitated at the edge. This wasn't part of the day's plan. My job was to note, not explore. But after years in the field, curiosity can override caution faster than you'd expect. I tested the ladder's top rungs, solid. The metal was pitted but not corroded through. I climbed down. The shaft went maybe 15 feet before it opened into a narrow corridor. The air felt cooler but heavier, as if it hadn't moved in decades. My light revealed smooth concrete walls, coated in a fine powder of decay. At the end of the corridor, a steel door stood half open. Someone had forced it long ago. The lower hinge was twisted. I stepped through into a room no larger than a garage. Rows of metal shelving lined the walls, holding what looked like old supply crates stamped with 1962, 1963, and government issue labels. A few cardboard boxes had collapsed under their own weight. I recognized the smell immediately: mildew, rust, and the faint tang of old canvas. I scanned slowly. There were water canisters, tin cans of powdered milk, and vacuum-sealed packets of biscuits. A rotary phone mounted on the wall hung limp, its cord severed. Beneath it, a clipboard lay on a small table covered in dust. The log sheet was faded but legible enough to read the last entry. Inspection complete, 10/3/2263, site maintained, J. Renner. After that, nothing. I should have photographed everything and left. Instead, I found myself wandering deeper, following the beam of my flashlight through a narrow hallway that branched off from the main chamber. The corridor sloped slightly down, maybe toward another section of the shelter. The deeper I went, the stronger the metallic odor became. Less like rust, more like something chemical. My boots scuffed against grit. At one point I heard a faint clink, like a pebble dropping ahead. I froze, listening. The silence afterward was immense. When I reached the end, I found another room, smaller, circular, with peeling paint and a single cot against the wall. A rusted lantern sat beside it. Someone had carved initials into the concrete near the headboard. Jar again. Maybe Renner. On the floor was a dented canteen and what looked like a stack of notebooks tied with string. I crouched down, my knees creaking, and brushed off the dust. The notebooks were military field issue, green covers, water-resistant pages. The top one was dated 1964, a year after the inspection log had ended. The handwriting inside was small, tight, and increasingly erratic toward the later pages. The first entry was neat: April 5, supply transfer complete, power generator stable, radiation meter nominal. The next pages shifted in tone: April 8, no contact with base station, radio static constant, possible line fault. April 10, hearing movement above at night, sand falling through vent shaft. I turned more pages. The writing became frantic, lines overlapping, words underlined 3 times. April 13, someone outside, voices, not ours. I stopped reading. My mind tried to rationalize. It could have been a training exercise, or a bored technician scribbling fiction. But the tension in the handwriting felt too real. I closed the notebook and looked around again. There was no sign anyone had entered in decades. The dust was undisturbed. The cot still held a collapsed shape of an old sleeping bag, the fabric stiff with age. I leaned closer and saw faint indentations on the pillow, as if the weight had never fully lifted. I decided to head back up. The air felt thinner, my breath catching more easily. When I reached the ladder, my flashlight beam passed over the hatch opening and froze. The wheel handle above had shifted. It was now turned slightly to the right, a position different from how I'd left it. My pulse kicked hard. I climbed faster, boots clanging against metal, and shoved the hatch upward. It resisted for a second, then gave way with a scrape. Sunlight poured in, bright enough to sting my eyes. I hauled myself out and slammed it shut behind me, the sound echoing through the canyon. I stood there in the hot afternoon light, breathing hard. The sky looked too open after that concrete dark. For a while I just stood, scanning the horizon for any sign of another vehicle or footprints. Nothing. My truck sat in the distance, a small silver glint. I checked my GPS. The coordinates had logged correctly. But when I opened the device history to verify the altitude readings, the final marker from inside the shelter was missing. The file ended right before the descent, as if the unit had cut out. That wasn't normal. It would usually still register coordinates even underground, though with error margins. I tried with sensing. No response. Back at the truck, I radioed again. This time a voice crackled through my supervisor asking for a progress update. I told him I'd found an old bunker and was marking it for evaluation. He asked for details, dimensions, access stability, any sign of contamination. I hesitated before answering. Structure's intact, I said. No radiation signage, probably sealed since the 60s. He paused, then said, copy that. Don't enter any deeper sections. We'll send an engineering review team next week. Understood. I didn't tell him I'd already been inside. I drove back toward the main road as dusk settled over the canyons. Shadows stretched long across the sand. I tried to shake the claustrophobic feeling, that strange awareness of being observed even in the open. Every sound felt amplified, the rattle of gravel under the tires, the wind cutting through rock spires. When I finally reached the paved highway, I felt a wave of relief, as if I'd stepped out of some time pocket. That night in my motel in Kanab, I couldn't sleep. My hands still smelled faintly of rust despite washing them twice. I kept picturing the hatch wheel turned the wrong way. I told myself it could have shifted from temperature change or wind pressure differences. But the mechanism was too heavy for that. Before turning off the light, I opened my field notebook to log the day's findings. A small smear of gray dust fell from between the pages, fine as ash. I brushed it away without thinking. It left a faint metallic taste in my mouth that didn't go away for hours. I woke before sunrise, the kind of half-sleep where every sound in the motel room felt amplified. The hum of the air conditioner, the distant hiss of traffic from Route 89. My mouth tasted of iron. For a few minutes I lay there, staring at the popcorn ceiling, trying to convince myself the unease from yesterday was just fatigue. Fieldwork does that. Long days alone, dehydration, bad food. It messes with your nerves. But I kept thinking about that wheel handle, the notebooks, the silence underground. So before breakfast I called my supervisor again, told him I'd go back out for higher resolution photographs and a depth measurement. He didn't argue. Be quick about it, he said. Weather's shifting south. You'll lose the light early. By the time I reached the plateau again, the wind had risen. It carried a grit that stung the eyes and coated my teeth. The sky was clear though, a flat blue stretched tight as glass. I parked in the same spot and checked the GPS receiver. Now it read clean, no missing data, no corruption. I logged a test coordinate and started the mile-long hike toward the depression. My boot prints from yesterday had already softened under wind-blown sand. When I reached the hatch, I stopped short. The surface looked different, not freshly disturbed, just shifted. One of the hinge bolts was lying beside the frame, snapped clean. That shouldn't have happened overnight, not without vibration, maybe thermal expansion. Metal does strange things in desert air. Still, I crouched, ran a finger along the edge. Cool to the touch, I photographed every angle, hinge markings, and lowered a measuring tape down the shaft. The air rising up smelled of dust and oxidized metal, same as before. I called out once, testing the echo. The sound came back delayed, distorted, like the shaft bent it. I told myself I wouldn't go all the way down again. Just a few rungs to check internal humidity and temperature. But once the beam of my flashlight hit the lower corridor, I felt the same pull as before, curiosity mixed with something heavier. At the bottom I noticed fresh debris along the floor. Not new exactly, but dislodged. Flakes of concrete. Fine sand on top of my boot prints from yesterday. It was possible they'd fallen from the ceiling due to air pressure changes. Possible. The main chamber looked the same. Crates, cot, phone. Yet something small was off. The clipboard on the table was flipped open to a blank page. I remembered closing it. I even had a photograph showing it shut. I stared at it longer than I should have, trying to rationalize. Maybe the air currents when I closed the hatch yesterday had shifted the paper. I knelt to inspect the notebooks again. The top one was still dated 1964, but the string binding them looked tighter, like it had been pulled recently. Dust didn't lie, though. There was no clean finger mark, no smudge. I forced myself to breathe slower. Document. Don't dramatize. I checked my instrument case. Thermometer reading 56 EF. Relative humidity 41%. Slight increase from yesterday, which meant air movement somewhere. My eyes followed the vent shaft near the ceiling. A narrow pipe running up toward the surface. Probably clogged. I made a note to include it in the report. Then I heard it. A soft metallic ring, distant. Faint, like a dropped bolt hitting another. I froze, light sweeping the walls. Silence returned, then another sound, sharper this time, 2 clicks in quick succession, echoing from the corridor behind me. Oh, my own voice sounded too loud. No answer. The smart thing would have been to leave immediately. Instead, I crept toward the sound, stepped slow. The secondary corridor ended in that smaller room with the cot. The air here felt warmer, and there was a smell. Old oil, maybe from machinery. I crouched and shone the light beneath the cot frame. The beam caught metal, small, rectangular. I reached under and dragged it out. A toolbox, dented and half open. Inside were wrenches, screwdrivers, a folded rag, and an empty holster imprint where something longer had once been. Crowbar or small rifle, maybe. The handles were coated in fine red dust, but not caked. I tried to recall if I'd noticed it yesterday. I hadn't. I photographed it, logged the find, and felt my pulse slow. These were just artifacts, someone's maintenance kit, left behind in '63. Nothing supernatural about that. Still, the unease lingered. Maybe because the silence after the clicks seemed too complete, like the air itself had thickened to listen. After another hour of measurements, I decided I had enough. I climbed back up, hauling my gear in one hand. Halfway to the surface, a vibration went through the ladder. Slight, almost like someone above had stepped on the hatch. I looked up, flashlight trembling. The beam lit the metal underside motionless. My breath fogged in the cold shaft air. When I pushed the hatch open, daylight hit me hard. Wind gusted, scattering grit into my face. Nothing but open canyon above. I hauled myself out, sealed the hatch, and turned the wheel until it locked. My hands shook slightly. I told myself again. Thermal contraction, air pressure. The sound of shifting metal amplified in a sealed space. Perfectly explainable. Back at the truck, I ate an energy bar, drank half a liter of water, and logged the data set into my laptop. Then I noticed the time. My wristwatch read 20:14 p.m., but the GPS timestamp on my notes showed 4:09 p.m. The device sometimes lagged when losing signal, but not by nearly 2 hours. I ran a calibration. The clock corrected itself to the watch's time. No obvious glitch. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that time underground had slipped differently. The wind picked up again. A low whistle across the open plateau. Sand hissed against the truck panels. I packed up, ready to leave. But as I turned the key, I saw movement in the side mirror. A flicker of light from the ridge above, maybe 50 yards away. Like a reflection, I killed the engine, stepped out, scanned with binoculars. Nothing there. Just the shimmer of heat against rock. But in that shimmer, for an instant, I thought I saw something upright. Metallic, box-shaped. Maybe another vent shaft or solar panel from some old weather station. I marked the bearing line and decided to hike up before dusk. The climb took 15 minutes. From the ridge top I could see miles of canyon stretching into the horizon. My truck looked small below. I turned toward the bearing mark. There, half buried in sand, was a rectangular panel roughly 3 feet across, tilted at an angle. I brushed away dust and saw a small glass faceplate, broken, but with dials underneath. A Geiger counter console built into the rock itself. The casing had rusted through, wires gnawed by rodents. A faded stencil read US date, of Civil de Seattle 9A. Station 9A wasn't on my maps. I photographed it, checked inside the cavity behind the panel. More cables ran downward, vanishing into stone. Maybe the shelter was part of a wider network, a communications relay. It made sense. These bunkers were often linked by buried wiring. Still, seeing it exposed on a remote ridge meant erosion had eaten through protective layers. I reached inside to test one wire. It crumbled at my touch, leaving a dark residue on my glove. I pulled my hand back fast, that metallic taste returning to my mouth. Probably oxidized copper. I told myself. Probably nothing. I headed back down as the sun dipped low. By the time I reached the truck, the shadows had lengthened into the gullies like black water. I started the engine and drove out without stopping again. At the motel, I dumped the day's data into the project archive, wrote a concise report, and attached the photographs. When I clicked upload, the progress bar stalled at 99% and froze. Network timeout. The desert Wi-Fi was unreliable, so I plugged in my hotspot instead. It connected, but the upload file name had changed on its own. SIT47A temp. Logi. That wasn't my label. My file was Utah Catchpoint 3. I checked the local folder. The name reverted to my version, but for a few seconds I'd seen that other one. Like the system had briefly synced with something else. I told myself I was overworked. Closed the laptop, showered, tried to eat. The TV murmured in the background, local weather, maybe thunderstorms north of Page. I half listened until a brief emergency alert banner scrolled across the screen. Civil Defense test transmission at 1900 local time. Civil Defense. The same name stamped on the shelter. Hatch the pole, the Geiger counter. I stared at it, that old logo from a different era flickering on modern news like a ghost. Then the anchor's voice corrected. That was an archival clip. Apologies, wrong footage aired. The screen returned to the forecast. I switched off the TV. Outside, the wind kept rising, throwing sand against the motel windows. Every gust sounded like the scrape of that wheel handle turning. I pulled the curtain tight, lay back on the bed, and listened. Somewhere in the night, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I let it ring twice before answering. Static. Then a faint voice, male, old, distant. Site maintained. The same words from the inspection log. Who is this? I asked. The static thickened. Then silence. I hung up and sat there, heart thudding. Checked the call history. No record. Not even a missed call entry. I left the phone face down and sat awake until dawn, convincing myself it was interference, a crossed line, maybe a replay of some automated archive system bouncing signals off old frequencies. When the first light hit the Red Canyon cliffs outside my window, I knew I'd have to go back one more time. If only to prove the fear was unfounded, that the noises, the missing timestamps, the phantom call all had practical explanations buried under dust and metal. Still, the last thought before I left for the field again was simple and absurdly clear. Whoever Jay Renner was, he hadn't left that shelter in 1963. The road back to the plateau felt different in daylight. Clearer, yet somehow emptier, like the color had drained out of the landscape overnight. I hadn't really slept. The hours between 3 and 5 blurred into a long argument with myself about protocol, sanity, and curiosity. But the call, the voice using the exact words from the 1963 inspection log, kept circling my mind until there was no question of staying away. Before leaving town, I stopped at a hardware store, bought a fresh pair of gloves, new rope, dust masks, and a small digital recorder meant for wildlife sound capture. I told myself I wanted clean documentation, but truthfully I wanted something that could play back the silence, prove it was silence. By the time I reached the turn-off past Big Water, the sky had gone pale with heat. I parked in the same rut and took my time packing gear. Every motion felt deliberate, like I was rehearsing a routine I'd once known by heart. Compass check. Flashlight batteries check. GPS signal steady. As I approached the hatch, the wind fell still. The quiet was startling. No insect buzz, no grit skimming the ground. Just the faint metallic scent that always seemed to hang around the place. The broken hinge bolt was gone. I searched the sand nearby, thinking maybe wind had rolled it downslope, but found nothing. I unlatched the wheel handle. It moved more easily today, almost too easily. When the seal broke, the air that came out was cooler than before, carrying a faint sweetness, like dry rot mixed with fuel. I clipped the recorder to my vest and started down. Each rung groaned under my weight, echoing off the shaft walls in a tight metallic rhythm. At the bottom, I paused and switched on the recorder. A soft red light blinked. I read out loud, site entry 0900 hours, visual inspection of structural integrity. No external movement detected. Hearing my own voice steady in that confined air helped. The corridor stretched ahead unchanged. Yet I noticed small details that hadn't registered before. Faint scrape marks near the doorway, parallel and recent. The flashlight beam caught tiny fibers clinging to the concrete, pale and frayed. Probably from my own rope, I reasoned, though the spacing didn't match. I stepped into the main chamber. Dust motes drifted like slow snow. The crate lids were warped open. Contents visible, cans of food now dented and flaking. But something new sat on the table, a tin mug filled halfway with what looked like water. I stared at it. My brain tried to reconcile the image. There hadn't been any open containers here yesterday. I leaned close. The liquid was cloudy, maybe condensation runoff from the ceiling. Still, it felt impossibly out of place. I took a photo and backed away. Then the recorder crackled. Not loudly, just a whisper of static that swelled and faded like a breath. I tapped the mic casing. The red light stayed steady. The noise didn't repeat. I kept documenting. Ambient temperature 57 degrees. Humidity 44%. Slight increase again, meaning more air exchange from somewhere. I followed the vent shaft line with my beam, tracing it to a panel high on the wall. The bolts were loose. I could almost fit my fingers in the gap. Inside, The darkness looked bottomless. Something ticked, a slow, rhythmic tap like a leaky pipe. I turned toward the hallway and followed the sound into the smaller chamber. The cot remained, rusted through at the legs, but there on the wall above it, a new stain spread downward, darker than dust. My flashlight caught a glint near the baseboard, metal filings scattered like someone had drilled recently. I crouched and brushed them together. Fresh. I didn't like the implication, but I forced the words into the recorder anyway. Possible recent disturbance, unknown tool residue, documenting for analysis. That's when the recorder emitted another faint burst of static, and underneath it, a voice. Not the earlier one, not clear at all, just a few syllables drowned in hiss. My first thought was radio interference, but there was no signal down here. I rewound a few seconds and played it back. Between my own notes, another voice slipped and copied that, then a thump, like a hand brushing the mic. I froze. The only explanation was that the device was picking up a residual loop. Old frequencies rebounding from metal structures can mimic that. It didn't mean someone else was down here. I repeated that thought until it sounded convincing. The air started to taste metallic again, sharp enough to sting my tongue. I checked the carbon monoxide detector clipped to my belt. It stayed green, safe levels. Still, my head felt heavy, pulse slowing in my ears. I crouched to rest and noticed footprints overlaying mine from yesterday. Boots, similar tread, but deeper. Maybe I double-stepped. I wanted that to be true. I turned way up the ladder. The recorder began emitting a low hum, continuous now. The red light blinked faster. I unclipped it, expecting a malfunction, but the hum deepened like feedback. Then silence. When I replayed, only a few seconds of the ascent remained before the recording cut off. At the surface, wind slammed into me hard enough to stagger. The sky had shifted to that washed out white that precedes a dust storm. I locked the hatch, sealed it as tight as I could, and returned to the truck just as the first gust hit full force. Sand scarred the windshield, reducing visibility to yards. Sat there, waiting it out, watching the horizon vanish. By late afternoon, the storm eased. Everything looked new again. Sand filled every footprint, every track. The desert is efficient that way. It erases you almost instantly. I started the engine, ready to drive back to Kanab, when I saw something jutting from the sand about 20 feet from the hatch. At first it looked like another vent pipe. Then I realized it was wooden. A signpost, half buried, tilted. I got out, brushed away the top. The lettering was almost gone, but I could make out, property of U.S. Bureau of Mines, test shaft 1961. That didn't fit the civil defense map data. Different agency entirely, meaning the shelter might have been built over or inside a converted mining test. That could explain everything. The unrecorded coordinates, the network of cables, even the strange chemical smell. Leftover mining residue seeps for decades. I took photos, marked the GPS coordinate, and climbed back into the cab. The explanation steadied me. Nothing mysterious, just overlapping bureaucracies and time. Still, when I reached town, I drove straight to the public records office instead of the motel. The clerk on duty, an older woman with thick glasses, recognized the form number on my project letterhead. When I mentioned the fallout shelter, she frowned. Those old things. Most got filled in during the 80s. She typed into her terminal. Which parcel did you say? South of Paria Plateau, grid 4D. She scrolled, squinting. Closest I find is a mine survey. Abandoned uranium test site, never officially closed. That put it right around your grid. Uranium. The word hit with a weight I hadn't expected. Was it active in the 60s? Briefly. A lot of those projects got folded into civil defense work when the funding dried up. They used the same facilities for drills. She looked up. You didn't go inside, did you? I hesitated just long enough for her to sigh. Honey, those places still read hot in spots. Maybe not lethal, but enough to mess with electronics. Headache is vertigo. You feel off? Maybe just the heat, I said. She printed a copy of the parcel record and slid it over. Keep that handy. If the county environmental office calls you, you didn't hear about this from me. The document listed, subsurface containment shaft 47A, active status unverified. There it was again, 47A. the same code that had appeared when my upload glitched. I traced the line of type with my thumb until the ink smudged. Back at the motel, I downloaded the day's recorder file to my laptop. It should have been one long clip, 28 minutes. Instead, it split into 3 segments. The last was exactly 47 seconds long, labeled Otosavo 47A. I hadn't named it. When I played it, the first 10 seconds were silence. Then footsteps, mine. Then a faint second set, offset by half a beat. At the 20-second mark came the hum during the climb, and at 35 seconds, a voice. Calm, male, slightly distorted, but unmistakably human. Leave it closed, Cole. My own name. The recording ended with the sound of the hatch seal snapping shut. I stared at the waveform on the screen, mind clawing for plausible routes. Electromagnetic interference splicing earlier field recordings. A name misheard through static. But the clarity of that final phrase left no margin for coincidence. I opened my GPS log again, zoomed in on the final coordinate cluster. The line of points stopped, then resumed 50 yards east of the hatch. As if the device had recorded a detour I hadn't made, I checked the timestamps. The gap between the last underground coordinate and the next surface reading was exactly 47 seconds. I closed the laptop and sat back, breathing slow. Every explanation still existed: a contaminated site, faulty electronics, archival data bleeding through radio bands, human error, all of it possible, logical, neat, but none of those things answered the simplest question: why a decommissioned shelter from 1963 still transmitted anything at all. Outside, the storm had cleared. The canyon air smelled of rain and dust. I should have packed and left for another assignment north of Escalante. But as the motel clock rolled past midnight, the recorder light on my desk blinked once, though it was switched off. A faint pop of static followed, then silence again. I didn't touch it. Instead, I sat there in the dark, the document from the records office folded beside me, staring at one printed line that refused to fade from memory. Subsurface containment shaft 47A operational status. Actives undetermined. By morning I'd stopped pretending I could ignore it. The file, the voice, the match between parcel 47A and the glitch name. None of it was going to let me sleep again until I ran it through official channels. I shaved, packed, and drove to the small BM field office in Kanab. The parking lot was half empty, a government sedan sat out front, antenna bristling. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed and smelled faintly of burned dust. The duty officer that day was a younger guy named Miguel Lansing, new hire, maybe late 20s. He looked up from his monitor when I came in. "Survey Cole, right? You're working grid 4D?
Yeah.
I've got an anomaly on one of the parcels. Old civil defense structure, possibly overlapping with a uranium test shaft." That got his attention. He motioned me closer, lowering his voice. "You found one of the fallout sites. Thought they capped those years ago. They missed one." I slid my laptop across the counter. "Coordinates here. Photos here. You'll want to loop in environmental and DOE." He plugged in a flash drive, copied the files, and clicked through the images. When he reached the hatch photo, he frowned. "This logo, Civil Defense Triangle, hasn't been used since '67. And you said uranium. Records office mentioned it. Shaft 47A. Listed as unverified containment." He typed something into his terminal, watching the cursor blink. After a minute, he said, "That's not in our database." "You sure it's 47, not 74, 47? I double-checked. He tried again, then leaned back. "Okay, that code's DOE. Energy Department handles decommissioned nuclear or radiological sites, not us. You'll want to file a cross-agency hazard report. I already sent a field note up the chain yesterday." No response. He nodded slowly, chewing the inside of his cheek. "Sometimes they ghost us for weeks. You want me to call my contact in Salt Lake? He owes me a favor. Please." He dialed, spoke quietly for a few minutes, then covered the receiver. "They're asking if you took any samples." "No, just photographs, temperature readings, and one air quality check. Safe range." He relayed that, listened, then said copy, and hung up. "Okay. They're sending a small verification crew tomorrow. 2 environmental techs and a structural engineer. You'll meet them on site at 0800 to guide access. That fast. They're nervous about liability. He hesitated. Cole, do yourself a favor. Don't go back today. Let them handle it. I wasn't planning to. I lied. He handed me a printed form. Fill this out before you leave. Just routine incident notation. While I signed, the office printer behind him started spooling another page unsolicited. A black and white document rolled out. Header reading Department of Energy. Restricted transmission. Miguel snatched it up before I could read the rest. Weird, he said, forcing a laugh. Printer ghosts. I left him staring at the jam light, expression tightening. Back at the motel, I packed slower than usual. The recorder still sat on the desk where I'd left it uddy dark. I considered deleting the file, even smashing the thing. Instead, I sealed it in a zip bag and shoved it into my field pack. Evidence, I told myself. Best to hand it over tomorrow. The day stretched long and airless. I walked to a diner for lunch, ate a sandwich I barely tasted, watched trucks roll past the window, each one disappearing into the same wall of heat haze. Around 3, I returned to the room to organize data for the inspection team. When I opened the laptop, a new folder sat on the desktop, Temp 47A Rakovar. I hadn't created it. Inside were duplicates of my own photos, same file names. But the metadata showed they'd been modified 2 hours earlier, while I was eating lunch. Every image looked slightly darker, contrast boosted, details sharpened. In the photo of the hatch, faint shapes seemed visible in the shadow of the opening. Noise artifacts, maybe, or my brain looking for patterns. I closed the laptop hard and unplugged the charger. I spent the evening pacing the narrow room. My phone buzzed once. A text from an unknown number. Site access confirmed. Maintain perimeter. No sender name, no reply option. I tried calling back. The line rang twice, then went to the same static hiss I'd heard 2 nights ago. By midnight, I gave up on sleep again and sat by the window watching the highway lights blink in the distance. I must have dozed off sitting upright, because the next thing I knew, sunlight had cut across the curtains and my watch read 6:42. I drove out early, reaching the plateau at 7:30. The government sedan from yesterday followed a few minutes behind, kicking dust. 3 people stepped out, 2 men in Tyvek suits and respirators slung at their necks, and a woman with a clipboard. She introduced herself as Dr. Marin Shaw, Department of Energy Environmental Response Unit. Her tone was brisk, professional, the kind that made you measure your words. You're Nathan Cole? Yes?
Ma'am.
Show us the entry. I led them across the sand. The hatch looked as it had yesterday, though the wheel handle bore fresh scuff marks. Maybe wind-blown grit, maybe not. Shaw ordered 1 technician to run a radiation wand around the perimeter. The device chirped faintly, then steadied. Background only, he said. She nodded and turned to me. You went inside twice. 3 times total, counting initial entry. Any physical symptoms since exposure? Headache, mild dizziness. Could be dehydration. Could be, she echoed without comment. They unspooled an air sampling hose and lowered it down the shaft. The readout on their tablet stabilized after a minute. Slightly elevated radon, trace mercury vapor, but nothing critical. Shaw crouched to study the wheel handle. This design predates our department, she said. Army Corps fabrication, likely late 50s. One of the techs called up from below. Ladder integrity's solid, no collapse risk. She looked at me. You comfortable leading us down? You know the layout. I hesitated but nodded. Straight corridor about 15 feet down, main chamber at the end, smaller room branching right. She motioned for me to descend first. The moment my boots hit concrete, that familiar chill wrapped around me. The flashlight beams of the others cut through dust in long cones. Shaw examined everything with detached precision, dictating into her recorder. Civil defense supplies present, no power generation visible, possible secondary vent line west wall. When she reached the table, she paused. Who moved this? The mug of water was gone. Only a ring of damp dust remained. I didn't touch it, I said. She glanced at me, unreadable. Document and bag residue. They photographed every corner, collected soil samples, scraped paint flakes, even sealed a small portion of the vent shaft for later analysis. When she stepped into the smaller room, she froze, beam fixed on the wall. "You see this?" The stain I'd noticed earlier had deepened, a vertical smear almost black now. Embedded near its center was a small metal tag, half rusted but still legible: USDFP ofn RGY Cote Intimentius 47A. Shaw exhaled slowly. "Containment, not shelter." "What does that mean?" I asked. "Probably an auxiliary waste deposit. During the early 60s, some uranium sites dumped low-grade material into sealed shafts. Later, they relabeled them as shelters to divert attention. Public relations trick. So what's under this one?" She met my eyes. "Well, find out." The techs ran a ground-penetrating sensor across the floor. The screen showed a cavity beneath, 10 or 12 feet deeper than the current chamber. A void roughly circular, filled with irregular shapes. "Buried tanks, most likely," Shaw said. "Or drums. Any danger of collapse? Doubt it. Concrete overlay looks intact." She paused, then added, "Though I don't like the vent alignment. Something's still open to the surface. Explains the pressure changes you recorded." They spent another hour logging data before Shaw called it. "We'll cordon off the site. Full excavation order will come through next week." As we climbed out, a low rumble rolled across the canyon. Not thunder, heavier, subterranean. The sand underfoot trembled once, then stilled. Shaw turned sharply. "Seismic. Nearest station's 50 miles, one tech said. Could be subsurface settling." Her eyes stayed on the hatch. "Or a void shifting." Back at the vehicles, she handed me a release form. "You're clear to debrief, but keep this quiet until we confirm safety levels." "Understood." She started to walk away, then added, "And Mr. Cole, destroy any independent recordings. Those can compromise chain of custody." I hesitated. "Understood," I said again. They drove off, leaving me standing beside my truck. The wind had returned, whispering across the plateau like breath through a pipe. I opened the passenger door, looked at the pack sitting on the seat. The recorder inside blinked once. Green light, quick and soft, even though I hadn't touched the power switch since yesterday. I stared until the light faded. Then I reached in, zipped the pack shut, and drove back toward town without looking in the mirror. That night in the motel, I drafted my final field report. Clinical, concise. Structure identified as decommissioned containment shaft. No personnel injuries. Awaiting DOE follow-up. I didn't mention the mug, or the tag, or the voice on the tape. When I finished, I sent it through the secure BLM upload portal. The progress bar reached 100% without issue. For a second, relief washed through me. Then a pop-up flashed. "Submission archived under Project 47A to status CTI." There was no option to close the window. Only a single line of text at the bottom, faint gray against white. "Maintain perimeter." I shut the laptop and sat very still, the sound of desert wind sliding under the door like breath through concrete. They came back 2 days later with heavier trucks and orange barricades that looked absurd against the red stone. The air smelled of diesel and dust. I'd told myself I wouldn't go. My contract role technically ended the moment the DOE took over. But I drove out anyway. Habit, maybe. Or the pull of unfinished coordinates. From the ridge I could see the small convoy parked around the depression. A canvas tent flapped in the wind, shielding a folding table stacked with monitors. "Doctor." Shaw stood beside a group of men in yellow hard hats, arms folded. I walked down, boots sinking into fresh tire ruts. She noticed me immediately but didn't look surprised. "You shouldn't be here, Mr. Cole." "I'm still the registered site surveyor," I said. "Until the closure's logged, it's under my project ID." That earned a reluctant nod. "Fine. Observe from the perimeter." I stayed by the truck as the team unbolted the hatch entirely, setting the steel disc aside like a lid pried off history. The sun hit the ladder and threw a pale shimmer down into darkness. A generator rattled to life. Cables fed light and air hoses into the shaft. A structural engineer named Beck descended first, roped to a harness. His voice crackled through a handheld radio. "Main chamber stable. No gas pockets detected." Shaw followed halfway, issuing clip directions. "Check subfloor seams. Any hollow sections." For 20 minutes, all I heard were muted thuds and the occasional scrape of metal on concrete. Then Beck's voice again. There's a panel here, embedded in the floor.
Welded shut. Dimensions? Shaw asked.
Roughly 4 by 4. Center seams rusted through. Proceed with perimeter drilling only. Don't breach yet. The generator's hum deepened as they fed power to a handheld cutter. Sparks spilled upward like fireflies in reverse. The smell of scorched metal drifted out of the shaft. I edged closer. What's under that panel? Shaw answered without looking up. Storage bay. We think it's where they placed the containment drums. Uranium. Low-grade tailings. If our records are right. Still hot enough to require shielding. Another burst of static from the radio. Beck sounded strained. Found lettering. Says sub, compartment A2, paint's peeling. Something else beneath it. Shaw frowned. Photograph first, then clear the area. A pause. Copy. But there's a marking underneath. Looks like a nameplate welded over the paint. The channel filled with grinding noises. Then Beck again, quieter. Tag reads Renner J. The name landed like a stone drop down a well. Shaw glanced at me. That mean anything to you? Maybe, I said. There was an inspection log signed that way. 1963. She didn't respond. Only tightened her respirator and went down herself. Minutes stretched. The canyon wind slowed until the only sound was the generator. Then, abruptly, a deep clang reverberated up the shaft, metal shifting under stress. Beck shouted something unintelligible. The radio cut out in a burst of static. Shaw's voice came through seconds later, clipped and steady. We've got movement beneath. Everyone clear the surface perimeter, now. The ground trembled faintly, dust rising in a thin veil. I backed toward the vehicles. Another jolt. Stronger this time. The hatch ring shuddered. One of the support brackets snapped with a sound like gunfire. Pull them out, someone yelled. 2 techs reeled in the safety line, straining. Beck emerged first, coughing through his respirator. Shaw followed, helmet smeared with gray dust. She waved the line crew back and signaled the generator operator to kill power. The sudden silence rang in my ears. She yanked off her mask. Subfloor collapsed about a meter. There's a cavity underneath full of corrosion product. Liquid seep, possibly contaminated. We're sealing it until containment specialists arrive. Her face was pale under the red dust. Who authorized you to come here? I needed to see the closure through. Well, congratulations. You just witnessed a near-failure event. I almost said sorry, but she was already barking orders to her team. They stacked sandbags around the shaft, anchored warning tape, and erected a metal frame over the opening. Within hours, the site looked like a wound stitched shut. By evening, the crew packed up to leave. Shaw lingered last, writing notes in her field book. I waited until she closed it. That nameplate, I said. Renner J, what happens to it now? Chain of custody goes to Dewey storage. Probably never sees daylight again. Who was he? She hesitated, then sighed. I checked our personnel archives. No employee listed under that name after 64. Could have been subcontracted. Could have been buried paperwork. Why? His inspection notes said he heard movement outside the vent. Shaw gave me the kind of look people reserve for small dogs barking at mirrors. Mr. Cole, everyone in that era heard things. Isolation, bad air, low-grade radiation exposure. It can make you paranoid. Don't romanticize it. I'm not romanticizing. I'm trying to understand why someone would weld their own name over a containment hatch. She closed her notebook. Maybe guilt. Maybe ownership. Doesn't matter now. She left me standing there. The wind tugging at the caution tape until it snapped against the metal frame in irregular rhythms that sounded disturbingly like breath. That night, the sky over the can flickered with dry lightning. I watched from the motel balcony, feeling the vibration of each strike echo up through the concrete rail. I tried to write my own closure report, but the words refused to line up. Around midnight, my phone buzzed. Unknown number again. I almost didn't answer. A man's voice, strained, older, spoke 3 words before the line died. Don't let them. Silence. Then the dial tone. I called back immediately. This number is not in service. The next morning I drove to the site expecting it to be empty, but a single truck remained, government plates, engine idling. Beck sat inside, staring at the dashboard. He rolled down the window when he saw me. "They sent Shaw to Page for debrief," he said. "Do pulled half the data overnight." "Already?" "Yeah, I stayed behind to secure the frame. But you might want to look at this." He handed me a printout. A cross-section from their ground, penetrating scan. The cavity below the floor showed not barrels but 3 rectangular outlines. Human-sized. "You're sure these aren't drums?" I asked. "Positive. Shape's wrong. And density signatures closer to organic matter, not metal." My stomach went cold. "Bodies." He shook his head. "Could be old dummies. They used mannequins in radiation tests. But the nameplate." He didn't finish the thought. I folded the printout and tucked it into my field book. "Thanks." As I turned to leave, he said quietly, "That call you got last night?" Shaw mentioned a similar one. Same phrase.
What phrase?
"Don't let them." She said it came through the comm line after we shut down power. No caller ID. Just that. The wind picked up, slapping the caution tape against the frame again. I left him there, the truck still idling, and drove until the canyon thinned into open desert. At a rest stop near Big Water, I spread the printout on the hood and studied it. 3 shapes side by side, each roughly 6 feet long. Above them, the faint outline of the welded panel, the tag Renner J. If the site had been a containment shaft, the easiest way to seal a leak would have been to entomb the workers who couldn't get out in time. It fit the timeline. The test ended abruptly. Records vanished, site renamed. A practical solution hidden under a patriotic label. I drove back to town numb. In the motel lobby, the television played a regional news loop. The ticker at the bottom mentioned, "Controlled demolition near Paria Plateau scheduled to continue through weekend." No specifics. Just a single quote from a DOE spokesperson. "Residual materials will be neutralized in situ." Neutralized. I spent the rest of the day drafting an email to my supervisor summarizing everything. Halfway through, the cursor froze. Then the screen flashed a notification. "Network connection terminated by remote host." I unplugged the laptop, hard hammering, and typed the report offline instead. I planned to print and mail it certified in the morning. When I finally lay down, exhaustion hit hard. The room's air conditioner rattled in uneven bursts. Between them, I thought I heard faint mechanical clicking, like a Geiger counter winding up. I opened my eyes. The recorder on the nightstand glowed green again, steady this time. I reached for it, thumb hovering over the power button. The light went out. The display showed one new file timestamped exactly 5 minutes earlier, while I'd been drifting toward sleep. I pressed play static, then wind, then my own voice. Calm, detached, as if reading a log. Containment confirmed. Maintain perimeter. The file ended. I stared at the recorder until the dawn blot across the curtains. Then I got up, packed, and drove north without checking out. Somewhere behind me, a stretch of desert was being sealed forever, and a name, Renner Jave, was being buried again under another layer of concrete and bureaucratic silence. And even knowing it was all explainable, radio bleed, contaminated data pressure changes, memory tricks. The thought that stuck was simpler and worse. Maybe nothing in that shelter had ever stopped working. I reached Salt Lake before dawn. The highway still wet from night rain. The city's light looked clean compared to the desert. Flat reflections on asphalt, radio towers blinking steady red. I parked in a 24-hour cafe lot and sat there until the sky began turning gray. The whistle-blower office was inside a plain federal building near downtown. Metal detector, badge check, the smell of floor polish. A young security guard scanned my backpack and frowned at the recorder. "Electronic devices need to stay here. It's evidence," I said. He called a supervisor. 10 minutes later, a woman in a dark blazer appeared. She introduced herself as Special Agent Dana Rusk. "Office of the Inspector General." No smile, just efficiency. "You filed a field anomaly report yesterday." "Yes. Containment Site 47A. It's being demolished without environmental clearance." She motioned me through the gate. "Let's hear it." Inside her small office, I laid everything out. Photos, coordinates, copies of the DOE correspondence, and the recorder in its sealed bag. She listened without interrupting, pen tapping the desk in slow rhythm. When I finished, she said, You believe the Department of Energy is concealing fatalities at this site. I believe they're erasing a record, I said. And that record includes 3 bodies under a containment floor. She studied me for a long time. You have physical proof. Round, penetrating scan. Printout. I slid the folded sheet across. She examined it, jaw tightening. You realize accusations like this require verification through multiple agencies. That's why I'm here. Verify it. Rusk sighed, rubbing her temples. All right, leave the materials. We'll log them under preliminary review. Can I get confirmation it's being handled? You'll get a case number. She filled out a form, signed it, and handed me the carbon copy. YXLC 221147A. My chest eased a little just seeing it in ink. As I stood, she added, Mr. Cole, stay reachable but avoid the site. Interference during investigation can void your testimony. I'm not going back. Good. Let us do our job. Outside, the sky had turned silver with overcast. I walked 3 blocks before realizing my phone had no signal. Not weak. None. I rebooted twice. Nothing. When I passed a bus stop, the public Wi-Fi registered, but the network name read 47A Go and Eat. It disappeared before I could screenshot it. I spent the afternoon at a cheap motel near State Street, waiting for someone from Rusk's office to call. No one did. By evening, I turned on the news. A short segment ran about a controlled demolition of obsolete defense infrastructure in Kane County. The footage showed a plume of dust rising from the plateau. No names, no agencies, just silence after the cut. I called the federal building. The operator said there was no Agent Rusk listed. I hung up, waited, called again under a different extension. Same answer. I sat on the bed staring at the recorder bag. The green LED blinked once. I hadn't touched it. I decided to drive to the regional newspaper. Maybe someone there would still care. The Deseret Journal occupied a low glass building on the west side. The night editor, a man named Foster, heard me out halfway before shaking his head. Anything nuclear goes through 10 layers of clearance, he said. If you didn't get photos of those bodies, we can't run it. They're under concrete now. He shrugged. Then it's a ghost story. He handed the recorder back. You seem tired, Cole. Maybe take a few days off. When I stepped outside, the parking lot was empty except for a white SUV idling across the street. Tinted windows. No plates I could read. I got into my truck and drove aimlessly north until the city lights fell away behind me. By midnight, I'd reached the edge of the Great Salt Lake. The air smelled like metal and rain. I parked near the old causeway, killed the engine, and sat in the dark. The recorder's green light came on again. This time I pressed play without thinking. A voice I hadn't heard before, flat, male, mid-range, spoke clearly over the wind noise. Field Surveyor Nathan Cole, Containment 47A secured. Declassification pending. Then my own voice followed, perfectly calm, acknowledge. The file ended. I sat there shaking, trying to reason it through. Spliced audio. Someone accessed the device, recorded over earlier files. But when? I'd kept it sealed since morning. I turned the key, meaning to head back to town. But the engine refused to start. Dead battery. I'd left nothing on. The stars overhead looked harsh and cold, each one mirrored in the black sheet of the lake. A pair of headlights appeared behind me after maybe 20 minutes. The same SUV. It rolled to a stop without switching off its engine. For a long time, nothing happened. Then the passenger door opened and Agent Rusk stepped out. No blazer now, field jacket, flashlight in hand. Mr. Cole, she said, voice steady. You left before we could finish processing your statement. You don't exist in the directory. That's intentional. She crouched near my truck door, lowering the beam. You brought the recorder. I hesitated, then held it out through the window. What's going on? Damage control, she said. The agency you reported doesn't want this equipment outside containment. It's not classified for public handling. Then why involve me at all? Because you already walked into it. She slipped the recorder into an anti-static pouch and sealed it. This will be destroyed. You heard the file? I asked. Her eyes flicked toward the lake. Yes. What was it? Residual broadcast. The old shelters use short band comms for testing. When the system rebooted during excavation, it pulled archived identifiers, your name included. Nothing supernatural, just data echo. Then why destroy it? Because echoes attract attention. The phrase chilled me more than I wanted to admit. Those shapes under the floor, what were they? She straightened, tucking the pouch into her jacket. Workers who sealed themselves in during the collapse. They fused the hatch behind them to contain a coolant leak. Radiation cooked everything that remained. That's all you need to know. That's all you'll tell me. She didn't deny it. You'll receive a statement to sign confirming chain of custody transfer. After that, I suggest you change assignments. Lightning flared far out over the lake. For a second it lit her face. Tired, expressionless. Then she walked back to the SUV. Wet, I called. Was Renner one of them? She paused at the door. He signed off on the closure. That's his legacy. The SUV drove away without headlights. I sat until the sky began to pale again, the lake turning gray-white around the edges. When I finally tried the ignition, the truck started instantly. Back in town, I found my motel room door ajar. Nothing inside was missing except the folded scan printout. On the desk sat a single envelope stamped with the federal crest. Inside, one sheet of paper, case US SLC 221147A. No further inquiry authorized, no signature. I packed slowly, checking the corners of the room as if expecting movement. My field gear looked harmless now. Just tools, dust, and a dead GPS. Still, I couldn't bring myself to touch the pack where the recorder had been. By afternoon, I was on highway heading east. The radio picked up nothing but static. I stopped once for gas near Green River. The attendant glanced at my license plate and asked, "You with the survey team? What team?" "They were through this morning. Government types. Said they were doing radiation mapping near the canyon. Funny thing, though, they mentioned your name. Wanted to know if you'd passed through." I paid in silence and drove on. Near dusk, I pulled off at a rest area overlooking a wash of ochre cliffs. The sky was clear again, the air too still. I found the case file carbon copy from Rusk, the one she'd given me at the federal building, and held it up to the fading light. The ink was smudged, almost gone, but the imprint beneath was visible. Project 47A, status active. I tore it into strips and let the wind take them one by one. They scattered down the canyon, caught sunlight, and vanished. As darkness settled, I told myself the story was finished, that the shelter, the voices, the data anomalies were all part of a decaying system, still looping through its final signals. Machines don't haunt. They just persist until the last current dies. Still, sometimes persistence looks a lot like remembering. When I reached the next town and checked into a new motel under a different name, the desk clerk handed me a keycard printed with a serial number. I didn't notice until later. Under the room's harsh fluorescent light, the number was 047A. The new motel sat off a frontage road outside Moab, a row of beige doors facing the highway. Nothing distinctive about it except the smell. Disinfectant cut with desert dust. I chose it because anonymity here was easy. Half the guests were seasonal workers, and no one looked twice at a man with sunburn and field gear. For the first 24 hours I did nothing. Slept, ate at the diner next door, walked the lot at night, listening to Semis groan past. Each sound seemed to press against the silence I'd carried from the canyon. By the second morning I started checking the news again. Nothing about 47A, not even the demolition. The story had vanished cleanly. The only article still cached on my phone redirected to an error page. I told myself that was closure, but the absence felt unnatural, like waking to find your own footprints erased. I spent the day drafting a final invoice for the bureau contract. Field completion, hazard notification, travel receipts, normal paperwork. When I hit submit, the portal returned a CCOUND CTIA DM and NSCRADO R. I called the regional office, disconnected number, tried my supervisor's cell, no longer in service. By evening I was pacing again. I turned on the motel TV for noise, local weather, then a documentary rerun about Cold War Utah test sites. Halfway through, the narrator mentioned containment protocols established in 1963 by engineer Jonathan Renner. The name tightened something in my chest. When I looked back at the screen, The program had switched to an ad. I drove into town just to move. The canyon air was sharp and mineral cold. At a gas station, I asked the clerk if they'd heard of a man named Renner. Engineer, maybe worked with the Bureau decades ago. The kid looked at me blankly. My grandpa talks about the uranium days, he said. Whole crews went missing. Paperwork ate him. He grinned like it was folklore. When I returned to the motel, a plain envelope waited on my door. No return address. Inside a single flash drive. I stared at it for a long time before plugging it into the laptop. One folder 47A RFE inside. 4 audio files labeled by date, each matching the nights I'd been on site. I listened. The first was my own field log from Part 1, the one I'd spoken aloud in the shaft. The second captured the day the DOE team arrived. Voices echoing, Shaw issuing orders. The third was shorter, metallic creaks, then my voice saying, "Containment confirmed." I hadn't recorded that. The fourth began with silence, then the faint sound of boots on sand. Shaw's voice, "Pull them out." Beck answering, "Grounds giving." Then a low groan, and finally another male voice, steady, calm, maybe mine but older, "Maintain perimeter." The file ended with the whine of a closing hatch. I sat back, heart thudding. It was all explainable. Radio bleed, reconstruction, spliced archives. But who compiled them and how they found my address here wasn't. At dawn, I drove to the post office intending to mail the drive anonymously to any newsroom that might still care. The clerk weighed the padded envelope, printed a label, and frowned. "System's not letting me process this ZP," she said. "Code comes back restricted, try another," I said. She typed again. "Same result. Weird." Never seen that. Took the envelope and walked out. I tossed it in a trash bin halfway down the block. The rest of the week blurred. I tried to pick up side contracts, trail surveys, equipment calibration, but my credentials wouldn't verify online. It was as if the BLM database had deleted me. My name still came up on public records, but every link looped back to a 404, access denied. One night, unable to stand the motel walls, I drove south into the canyonlands just to see open space again. The road twisted through black rock glowing faintly under starlight. At a turnout, I parked and climbed a low ridge. From the top, I could see miles of empty desert. Then, far to the west, a brief orange flash flared against the horizon, silent, distant, gone almost before I registered it. Controlled burn, I told myself. Demolition residual. But it came again a minute later, smaller, like a beacon blinking twice and dying. I stayed until cold forced me back to the truck. At the motel, a message waited on the room phone. A recorded voice, mails case 721147A closed. Perimeter maintained. Click. I called the front desk. "Who left that message?" "Automatic," the clerk said. "System glitch. Happens sometimes." The next morning, I packed for good. I headed north toward Colorado, planning to lose myself in contract work somewhere no one cared about numbered sites. But halfway up Highway 191, my GPS died mid-route. The screen froze on a coordinate, 3747N47 again. I pulled over, took a photo of the display, and restarted it, blank gray map. When I drove on, it rebooted itself every few miles, always defaulting to that same coordinate. By dusk, I reached a rest stop outside Monticello and killed the engine. I told myself I'd throw the GPS into the trash and forget it. But before I did, I zoomed the frozen map one last time. The marker sat directly over the plateau I'd first driven across to find the hatch. The site, they said, was demolished. I drove back. The dirt track looked the same at first. Wind rutted, no tire marks. The barricades were gone, the frame gone, even the depression half filled by sand. I parked where the hatch should have been and walked the area with a flashlight. Only wind, sagebrush, and the faint odor of burnt metal. Then the beam caught a patch of concrete half, buried under grit. Fresh, lighter color. I brushed it clean. In the center, a small metal tag gleamed, stamped into it 47A, Final Seal 2025:N. For a moment, I couldn't move. The letters were precise. Machine engraved, not hand-etched. Someone had cast my name into the closure record. I backed away, heart slamming, until my boot hit another object half, buried in sand, a yellow marker pole. Freshly painted triangle symbol, crisp and new. Civil defense. The wind rose, whistling through the canyons like air through a vent. I turned toward the truck. The engine started first try. I didn't look back. That night I crossed into Colorado, checked into a roadside motel, and sat with the lights off, listening to the faint buzz of the power lines outside. I kept the tag in my pocket, cool against my palm. Everything remained explainable: paperwork error, memorial plaque, misfiled coordinates. It didn't matter how unlikely each was on its own. They still added up to coincidence if you needed them to. But sometimes coincidence feels like design wearing dust. I set the tag on the nightstand beside the room phone. The plastic still smelled faintly of ozone from the desert. When I lay down, the air conditioner clicked on and off in irregular bursts. Between them, I thought I heard a soft mechanical hum, the kind that runs under old electrical systems long after power is cut. I told myself it was plumbing, and for the first time since I opened that hatch, I slept through the night. In the morning, the tag was gone. In its place lay a small strip of carbon paper folded once, the same kind used in 1960s inspection logs. Across it, one line in faint gray ink: site maintained, Jr. Morning light through motel curtains always looks the same, thin, colorless, indifferent. I sat up slowly, half expecting to see the metal tag back on the nightstand, but only the folded carbon slip remained. I turned it over in my hands. The paper felt brittle, edges yellowed like something pulled from a file decades old. The handwriting, those two letters, Jr., was faded but fresh enough to smear. I folded it back and slid it into my field notebook. Proof of something, even if I didn't know what. I checked out before sunrise and drove east. I didn't have a destination, I just wanted distance. By mid-morning I'd crossed into western Colorado, where mesas turned to pasture and cell signal returned. My phone lit with missed calls, 2 from unknown numbers, 1 from an unlisted federal exchange, no voicemails. I stopped at a rest area and used a pay phone to call the only contact who might still pick up. Miguel Lansing from the Canab field office, the younger officer who'd first escalated the report. The line rang 5 times before a man answered. "This is Lansing," he said, cautious. "Miguel, it's Cole." A pause. "You're not supposed to be calling this line. I need to know what's happening with 47A. He exhaled audibly. "It's closed. DOE took full jurisdiction. They sealed it yesterday." I saw that seal. It had my name on it. Another silence, heavier. "Then you already know too much. I just want the record straight. Were there casualties back in '63? He hesitated again. "Off the record. Yeah, 3 technicians. There was a leak during a containment test. They couldn't risk breaching the surface, so they sealed the lower chamber with them inside until decay levels dropped. By the time anyone went back, the site was already classified. Renner filed the closure himself, so it was a burial. It was containment," he corrected softly. "Same thing, different paperwork." I gripped the receiver tighter. Why the secrecy now? Because some of those old reactors used experimental isotopes, stuff that doesn't show up clean on environmental scans. If the media thinks there's hot soil under national land, they'll shut down half the plateau. Millions in contracts gone. And Renner? Renner retired on disability. Died in '84. Miguel's tone shifted, less official, more wary. "You did your job, Cole. Let this one go." He hung up before I could answer. I stood there listening to the dial tone until it stopped. Then I drove north toward Grand Junction. The road cut through empty rangeland, wind flattening the grass in waves. I kept thinking of those technicians sealed below. Names never recorded, legacy reduced to a code on a tag. I wondered if Renner had volunteered or been ordered, and whether guilt echoes, the way radio waves sometimes do, long after transmission ends. In Grand Junction, I found a small public library with a quiet corner and an old microfilm reader. I searched for any mention of Renner. The containment, the fallout drills. Hours of scrolling through archived headlines. Uranium strikes, civil defense fairs, missile tests, but nothing about a shaft collapse or fatalities. Then, buried in an August 1963 issue of the Salt Lake Tribune, a 1-paragraph notice: local engineer commended for emergency management during Paria containment drill. Details withheld pending review. That was it. No follow-up, no obituary, no correction. just a line that implied heroism without context. I printed the article, folded it beside the carbon slip, and stared at both until the words lost meaning. That night I stayed at a highway lodge. Rain came hard against the window. I pored over my field notes one last time, trying to assemble them into something coherent enough to report. The pattern was clear, sealed site, bureaucratic cover, environmental risk. But every route toward proof, data files, photos, the recorder, was gone or compromised. All that remained were memories and paper fragments. I drafted one final statement on my laptop, plain and factual, on October 12, 2025. While conducting a Bureau of Land Management survey in Kane County, Utah, I located an unregistered containment structure later identified as Doe Site 47A. Subsequent investigation revealed the site to be a decommissioned uranium test shaft containing sealed remains of 3 technicians from 1963. Federal representatives later confirmed and permanently sealed the site. This statement is provided for public record. I saved it to an external drive and uploaded a copy to a public archive under a pseudonym. No sensationalism, no ghost stories, just facts. Whether anyone ever found it didn't matter. Truth doesn't need an audience, it only needs to exist somewhere outside of silence. At dawn, I left Colorado heading east. Somewhere past the state line, my truck's radio crackled alive for the first time in days. Not a station, just a steady tone, then a clipped male voice repeating coordinates. Not 47A this time, but a different sequence entirely, somewhere near the Nevada border. I turned it off before I could write them down. I reached Kansas 2 days later and picked up temporary work surveying irrigation lines. Flat country, quiet people. The land there feels honest. No echoes, no hidden layers beneath your feet. I tried to convince myself that what happened in Utah belonged to another lifetime, one I'd filed away. But every month, without fail, an envelope arrives at whatever mailbox I'm using. No return address, just my name printed neatly. Inside, a single sheet of government letterhead, blank except for one line stamped in faint gray, perimeter maintained. I've learned not to throw them away. You can't outdrive a record once your name's written into it. Sometimes I think about Renner, the engineer who welded himself behind a hatch to keep poison from spreading. Maybe he wasn't a villain or a martyr, just a man doing math under pressure and realizing the simplest equation: if 3 stay, thousands live. I wonder if he knew someone like me would find the hatch decades later and start the loop again. That's what it feels like now, a loop. The data glitch, the voice, the tag. Bureaucracy is just another machine, and machines repeat their last instruction until someone cuts the power. I haven't gone back west since. The truck still carries a film of red dust on its undercarriage that refuses to wash off. Sometimes when I drive at night, the headlights catch motes of it swirling like ash. And once in a while, when the road's empty and the air's dry enough, I swear I can hear a low mechanical hum beneath the tires. Steady, patient, almost alive. It's probably the transmission. But a small, unreasonable part of me thinks it's the sound of something buried deep in desert concrete, still running. Not haunted, not supernatural, just enduring. Like every other forgotten system built to protect us from ourselves. They called it a fallout shelter. I think it was a tomb for responsibility, and the worst part about a tomb is that it keeps its promise perfectly. It never lets anything out,